Okay, so we're going to go ahead and launch this meeting today. Um, Let me just share the screen so you can see what I'm seeing here. Before I get into this, chapter of LERA to be making our own little contribution to this webinar series. And before we go any further, I want to thank Tom Koken, the LERA staff in Illinois, and a real special thank you to Joel for organizing this and giving us a really great forum. Let me go to our next slide because there's a few organizational matters to discuss. First off, this session is being recorded as we speak. If anybody does not want this recorded, please let us know in the chat box. And if any one of the participants doesn't want it recorded, we will turn off the recording. Secondly, there may be some journalists on this session. And so you should be aware that anything you say could potentially be on the record. I'm going to leave it at that. We were considering just allowing people to go off the record, but to the extent that notice doesn't come to us very easily, I just want to make sure that people know that potentially whatever you say is going to be on the record. So let me make some brief introductions for myself and the panelists, and also let you know that this presentation that you're looking at right now will be made available to anybody that wants it. And on the last page of the presentation are more detailed biographies of each one of the panelists with contact information. So my name's Bob Chiaravalli. I'm a labor lawyer and I represent management in labor law matters. And I also consult with them on non-law through our firm called Strategic Labor and Human Resources. Also on the panel is Freya Weberman. Freya is a labor representative and an attorney for the Michigan Educational Association. She is also one of our chapter's vice presidents. Next, we have Elizabeth Chiaravalli. Elizabeth has been involved in organizational consulting and strategy for about the last 10 years. And recently, she entered the graduate program at Michigan State University's HR and Labor Relations program. And in our last slot is Terry Morgan. Terry's an attorney, and more importantly, she's the regional director for the National Labor Relations region here in Detroit. We will go through these short presentations, and for most of it, the only people that are going to be unmuted will be the panelists. And at the end of those presentations, Bernadette will unmute everybody, at which time you can either orally ask a question or comment, or you can put it in the chat. Between me and Joel, we'll be taking a look at the questions that come through and hopefully getting to most of them. So the structure, the presentation here was a realization that we are in an era that is no longer pre-COVID. We're now COVID and post-COVID. And we are going to be sharing from a management perspective, a labor perspective, a perspective of an organizational consultant and somebody from a different generation, and from the labor board, what we might need to consider in terms of our approaches and structures going forward. So when I'm counseling management on engagement, for years, my practice was a traditional labor law practice, but over the years, strategic organization, strategic development, and design and communication have become a bigger part. And we have some guidelines for almost all of this from the folks that have been doing this work for so many years. And in this presentation, I want to suggest how we might use some of those structures going forward, because certainly there will be mistakes made in leaning on some of the structures and approaches we've used in the past. Hopefully we'll minimize some of those. So number one on the hit parade, you need to over communicate. in many, many different platforms. And remember, repetition is an art form. For those people managing teams, it is important to have team huddles, and there are structures for this. And for those that manage people directly, you want to be sure to continue to have one-on-one conversations. I'm not going to go through too much of the technology leveraging because I think it's obvious to most people. So I'm going to move on. So a couple things I want to focus on here. Again, not too much on these new platforms like Zoom, but many of you may not know that the FMCS is a wonderful technology program or platform called TAGS. It's been around for a lot of years, and people have been able to use it with FMCS facilitator or moderator to do mediation and collective bargaining. In my practice, I haven't used it too much because we've really leaned on personal meetings. But this may be something that our audience wants to learn more about. And what can you do with these technology tools? Certainly bargaining and mediation. If you're managing a team, what are the plans for the day? As always of importance, how do you support and resource the people you're working with? How do you look at the changes that are happening? And we must always continue, what is the physical and emotional well-being of the people on our teams? So what are some of these OD structures that we've leaned on for years? One, we govern many of our organizations through policies, rules, collective bargaining agreements. This is a good time to take a look at how these contemplate remote workers. Clearly, any kind of strategy that includes working on goal setting. How do you develop and mobilize a team in the COVID-19 era and post? Because we are LERA and because we believe in labor management cooperation, this is a wonderful platform to use what we've learned in labor management partnerships. Couple other things here from the automotive industry and maybe some of the other industries that have used root cause analysis and Kaizens. Again, great. If you're in a complex organization, RACI charts are very important. RACI charts define the response and information requirements that teams in complex settings. And let's not forget, people still need to participate and be recognized for their participation and achievements. So what can we use these things for? We can use them to solve departmental challenges. Are costs too high? What are we doing with our inventory? How are we handling our workforce issues? Cash is going to be very important. When we engage everybody from our organizations, we can look at ways to address these problems with solutions. So I'm going to turn it over to Freya. Freya will be representing a perspective from labor. Freya, it's yours.
Thank you, thank you. Welcome, hello to everyone. I hope everyone is safe and healthy. First, I want to thank Bob Chiaravalli, a longtime Detroit LERA leader, for inviting me to join this important conversation, national conversation, about labor and management relations, something that is close to my heart for sure, and I imagine everyone in the room. I also want to thank LERA for the important work they do on the national level, as well as the BEST chapter, of course, in Detroit. So I want to tell you who I am and what I do so you understand there's a context to the perspective that I'm going to give you on my view of things. So I am a labor representative for public school employees, professional, as well as support personnel, as well as a library in the area. Again, professional and support personnel. I am staff. I am not an elected labor leader. In my opinion, unions are about the rank and file, about the leaders. I am there to serve them. I have a job because of them. I serve at their direction. My job involves collective bargaining, advocacy, and organizing. So I cannot leave my political stripes at the door. So it's going to come through likely loud and clear. Some of you will agree with me and some of you won't. And at least on the labor side, we know the name of the game across the country, and certainly in Michigan, is organizing. Michigan has been right to work for less. The law passed in December of 2012 and went into effect in March of 2013. So union shop is gone. Along with that, payroll deduction of dues is gone. And so what we do every single day in everything that we do is to demonstrate the relevancy of the union and the value of the union. And organizing is 24/7, and it happens when I'm advocating, whether it be with counsel on the other side or a superintendent with my own members, whether it's collective bargaining. We are always demonstrating the value of the work that we do and how important it is to have a collective voice. So I want to talk a little bit about organizing remotely and how do we stay in touch. So just a quick little personal story. I remember when I had my first child and the nurse said, oh, this doctor is a hoverer and the other one is the guy who leans against the wall with a Starbucks. Which one do you prefer? I said, I'm a hoverer type. And so I am like that with my members. I'm there for them, for whatever role they want me to play. If I need to step back, I step back, I follow their direction as to what role they want me to play. But I think it's very important to have, as Bob said, over communicate. And so I schedule meetings all the time, whether they be with a bargaining team, with a leadership team, with individual members. So frequent online meetings, there is lots and lots to talk about. So with regard to working conditions, just for example, under COVID, in Michigan, brick and mortar K through 12 education was suspended, and now teachers and other employees are performing their services from home. So what does that look like? What does instruction look like for teachers who are working remotely from home? What does it look like for a social worker? How does a choir director perform his or her job? How are employees going to be evaluated, which now in Michigan is statutory and no longer in the collective bargaining agreement for certificated teachers? What does it mean for custodial staff, for office workers and bus drivers? How does it change the terms and conditions of employment of these different groups of employees? And what role does the union play? So many things are controlled by the collective bargaining agreement. There are other things that are controlled by statute or board policy. There's some things that we have a right to bargain about. There's some things we have a right to beg about. There's some things we have a right to collaborate about. So what role do we play? What is it going to look like, and it's already started to happen, when we return to work? How are we going to ensure the health and safety of our members in terms of personal protective equipment, cleanings of the buildings, and other things like that? What are paid leaves? I've got library people that they're going to return. We've got a summer break for school. We have a traditional calendar year for public education for most of Michigan, rather than a balanced calendar. So it's September through June. What is that going to look like when people return to the library? What happens if I am COVID positive? What happens if I'm in an immunocompromised situation, although not COVID positive? Can I return to work? So I meet up with my people, Google Chat, whatever, and talk about, paid leaves. The law that was recently passed, the Families First Corona Relief Virus Act, and the paid leaves that are provided under that. How does that work in conjunction with FMLA? How does that work in conjunction with FMLA that was, there's a new FMLA that was just passed as part of that bill. It looks like Bob has told me I need to speed things up, so I've got lots and lots of things to talk about, but I just want to cover a few things. At the beginning of this phone call, one of the people that was in the room alerted us that are in Michigan and those outside that there's going to be another protest at the Capitol today. This is a perfect time to talk about a recent situation that I had. I was having one of my regularly scheduled executive board meetings with one of my support groups. I asked, we all do a round robin, how are you? One woman, a young woman married with children who works in order to pay for healthcare for her family at a $12 an hour job, who gets single subscriber healthcare through her employer. She said, I'm in a crappy mood. I said, what's going on? She said, I'm in the basement of my mother's home. I took my kids and I left my house. My husband went to Lansing, the capital of Michigan, for a protest, and I just can't deal with it. For those of you who don't know, we have those people that want to liberate the states, who have handguns and rifles that are protesting in Lansing. And so you see the social and emotional needs of our members are so critical at this time. So although I have much more to talk about in my outline, I'm just going to cut to the chase here and say that what I do is when I end a meeting, before I end a meeting with any group, I always have another meeting scheduled. And I reach out to my bargaining teams, my executive boards, as well as the rank and file members. And we are doing substantive efforts to keep them engaged in terms of teacher certification rules, or what does retirement look like, as well as more of the social and emotional. I have daily updates that I give them on soft issues. How do you take a virtual field trip with your kids? So things like that. Again, I thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing from Elizabeth and Terry.
Thank you, Freya. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Hey all, thank you so much, Freya. So today I'm gonna cover how my perspective as a consultant and organizer informs my belief in distributed governance systems, how autonomy, accountability, and trust are essential principles in horizontal and all-effective systems, how COVID-related challenges highlight the strengths of distributed governance systems, and lastly, how any organization can bolster trust and engagement through really effective facilitation. So to get right into it, again, my name is Elizabeth Chiaravalli, and for about the last 10 years, I've been working in organizational development and design. Mainly, I've been serving as a consultant and organizer to nonprofits engaged in high stakes, high risk, low resource campaigns. Concurrently, I've been facilitating leadership and development courses through experiential education. So in all of these situations, employees are mainly intrinsically motivated, and effective engagement is critical to bringing out their full capacity. So this has given me the perspective that distributed governance systems are the most effective and efficient way to do this. So distributed governance can look a lot of different ways. You might have heard of a spokes council, affinity groups, agile teams, holacracy, consensus, and these are just to name a few. So underpinning these and all effective teams are autonomy, accountability, and trust. So these distributed governance systems are especially well adapted to remote work and the COVID situation we're in right now. So first, remote work can offer a ton of accountability for members and employees. And stopping the spread of the virus requires individuals to make dozens of nearly unpoliceable choices a day to protect the greater community, as well as requires all of us to have a very high level of trust in people that we typically wouldn't trust or don't know yet. So in the COVID context, autonomy, accountability, and trust are even more essential. So like I said, people are already fairly autonomous because of the remote work. And most established organizations already have clear structures of accountability. But it's frequently a lot harder to build trust and engagement, especially in this remote environment that we're in. So luckily, trust can be built through effective engagement. And a great way to do this is through constructive and transparent facilitation of remote meetings. So the following are a handful of tips that I try and incorporate into every meeting or training that I'm facilitating. And this is either online or in person. So you're probably familiar with some of these, but some of them maybe less so. So first, every meeting should have a goal. And relationship building can be a goal. If there aren't clear articulated goals for that meeting, the meeting shouldn't happen. Second, every meeting needs to have a written agenda. Obviously, this is so folks can prepare, but from a trauma-informed perspective, this allows people to fully relax and engage in the topics at hand because people can know what's coming next. It also allows people to categorize the subject matter of the meeting because they can see what subjects will be covered. Third, any meeting with more than 5 people needs a facilitator. The role of this facilitator is to make sure the goals of the meeting are met, not just we're going through the agenda, but the actual, we're making progress on the goals, and make sure all voices are being heard. If somebody's perspective isn't essential in that meeting, their participation should not be mandatory. Fourth, every meeting should include the following ways to engage. So first, the facilitator talking to the whole group. And second, a participant talking to the whole group. These are the most common and, in my opinion, most overused way of facilitating meetings. Next, every meeting should include silent reflection. This allows people who want to delve more deeply into the subject matter actually the time to do so. This will also help your organization catch errors a lot sooner because it takes a pause and has each individual critically evaluate the decisions or subject matter that's being discussed. Next, every meeting should include written feedback. In a remote context, this is super easy using the chat box. Next, every meeting should include spatial or spectrum feedback. This can be as simple as a thumbs up, medium, or thumbs down, or asking participants to rate their agreement to a different subject on a 1 to 10 scale in the chat box. A lot of people are also doing very interesting things with concurrent Google documents, the same way that many of us have used Post-it notes or butcher paper. You can use that on a Google Doc. That's a live document that everybody's using. Next, and this is a little bit harder in a remote way, but having people talk to each other in pairs and then having people talk to each other in small groups. I frequently find as a facilitator, pairs and then groups of 3 and 4 generate really different types of ideas. Most platforms have an option for breakout rooms. Fifth, never ask a question that you are sure you know the answer to. This isn't transparent facilitation if you're doing this, and it's a waste of the people's time in the meeting. Similarly, never ask for input on something you have already decided. Again, not transparent and not a good use of time. Lastly, I'm gonna use what's called a do-ocracy. So the people doing it have the biggest vote. So the people who are most impacted by a decision and the people actually doing the work that this decision entails have the largest say in it. So in conclusion, distributed governance systems have a lot to teach us, especially in this new COVID context. Horizontal and all effective teams are rooted in autonomy, accountability, and trust. And we can use effective engagement to increase engagement and trust. And then this improves member and employee capacity and performance. Thanks so much, and on to Terry.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Terry, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Bob. Thank you everyone for attending, and let me just jump right into it. I represent the government point of view on what's going on. I'm the Regional Director for the National Labor Relations Board, and I just wanted to touch on issues that you might want to think about as you go forward surviving this part of the COVID emergency and how you restart. Just a little bit about the agency. The agency is working. We are 100% telework at this point. So a lot of the stresses and challenges you're facing, the agency is facing as well. I have a staff of 35 people. Some of them are used to teleworking and some of them have never done it before. And it's been challenging over the past month and a half to really kind of get everyone in the swing of things. So we're experiencing a lot of the same issues that you are. I want to just talk a little bit about the agency is running and processing representation cases. There was a slight delay in that, but we're back up and handling petitions for elections. In situations where we already had pending elections that were going to be in-person voting, we've asked the parties to amend their agreements to run mail ballot elections, and in many cases, those parties have done so. If one of the parties refuses to do that, we've had the option of revoking stipulated election agreements and forcing everybody to a hearing to determine whether or not it's appropriate to run a mail ballot election. And that is, when that is the only issue on the hearing, we've been successful in conducting those by telephone. Going forward, we're going to, if there are other issues besides the mail manual ballot issue, we're going to be running those by government Zoom government. We don't have that platform yet. We don't really know how that's going to look, but I think that's going to start June 1st. But at this point, I'm not aware of any region running an in-person election during this emergency. There's a number of board decisions that sort of have been refining this that have issued recently, and I would encourage everyone to go to our website, NLRB.gov. There's a lot of interesting, well, from my point of view, interesting things on there, and you can sort of track how the case law is developing in response to the emergency. With respect to C cases, we are investigating unfair labor practice charges as they are filed. We're doing this electronically, talking to parties telephonically, taking telephone affidavits, getting electronic documents and evidence filed directly into our case handling system. One of the most recent developments is that if there is a board decision or an ALJ decision that comes up during the course of this pandemic and the company is closed and can't comply with the notice posting provisions, there's language now in a case called Danbury Ambulance, which was issued on May 6th, which provides that an employer will not have to comply with that until such time as they have reopened and there's a substantial complement of employees back at work. We are building that into that same remedy we are building into any settlements that we try to negotiate during this pandemic, so that a settlement can be reached and the agreement will be that the posting will occur when there's an opening of the building and a substantial number of employees come back. We have unfair labor practice trials that are conducted before administrative law judges. Those have been, anything that was scheduled April, May, June have been postponed without a date. Oh, excuse me, April, May. The June hearings are still on. And what I'm seeing from the judges division is that they are scheduling those hearings to be held by video conference using this Zoom government platform. So at this point, we're going to start conducting unfair labor practice hearings again. I just also want to just touch on some issues as you go forward and you're working in getting your business back up and communicating with your employees and communicating with the unit employees that you represent. Just some issues to just kind of be aware of as you go along, because the National Labor Relations Act still applies. There is a duty to bargain if you are an employer and you want to make changes. The General Counsel issued a memo, GC 2004, which gives some guidance on bargaining during an emergency. And generally speaking, the obligation is there. Employers have been successful in defending against unfair labor practice unilateral changes only where they've made the changes in response to exigent circumstances that were unforeseen. So an employer who made changes in response to Hurricane Rita did not violate the act when he did that, when that employer did that. Kmart did not violate the act when it reduced its staff because it lost 60% of its business in the aftermath of 9/11. But it has to be a really significant exigent circumstance for 8A5 to be, for you not to violate 8A5 if you make a change. If you do make a change, you still have to bargain over the effects of that change. So if the union comes and asks you to bargain over the effects of that great big layoff you just announced, you're going to have to discuss that. And once the emergency is over, you cannot continue to maintain those emergency changes. You have to go back to what it was. And you do have an obligation to provide requested information that relates to those changes. In the 8A3, which is discrimination against people who engage in union activities, 8A3, that section of the Act still applies. I'm not aware of any emergency exceptions for that. That means somebody who's campaigning for a union, you would violate 8A3 if you retaliated against that individual because of their support for a union. Somebody who raises rights under the collective bargaining agreement, still that would trigger an 8A3 violation if you took some sort of retaliatory action. Under 8A1, protected activity, which is if you make statements or take conduct that interferes with or restricts an employee's right to engage in protected activities such as union organizing or raising other issues involving wages, hours, and working conditions, 8A1 still applies. In the news, we've all seen people walking out to protest unsafe working conditions, speaking to the media about what they believe are unsafe conditions. Those could also trigger 8A1 protected concerted activity issues. If a charge came in involving those, we would be looking at why was that person fired, disciplined, whatever, to see whether or not the reason was a protected reason. The other very interesting thing is you're talking here about communicating with workers and getting their cooperation and trying to help get through this whole process. And you may want to form, let's say, a committee to discuss how do we restart? How do we get back in place? How do we make this place safe for everyone? And you can do that, but please be aware that if you create an employee committee, you might be creating a labor organization within the meaning of the National Labor Relations Act. And if that, then you might trigger a violation of Section 8A2 of the Act, which is providing unlawful support for a labor organization. There are two key cases I want, if this is going through your mind that this is a good idea, take a look at, there's two cases. There's one called electromation, which is 309 NLRB 990 from 1992, and another one involving E.I. DuPont, which is at 311 NLRB 893. In electromation, the employer formed committees in a non-union setting. And everything was going well until the Teamsters decided they wanted to organize, and then electromation and these committees became an issue. In E.I. DuPont, it was a union setting, and setting up those committees also created a labor organization, and the employer there also fell into, ran afoul of 8A2. In E.I. DuPont, the board actually kind of thought about, well, what could an employer do to avoid a labor organization and unlawful support for that organization? And they talked about maybe developing brainstorming committees where people are just generating ideas and coming up with, ideas about how to solve the problem or address the issue. And the employer doesn't bargain or discuss how they would implement that, but they simply, I'm 2 seconds away. They simply take that information in and make their own decision, and they don't engage in a back and forth discussion. And the last issue I wanted just to raise, and this is only in the context of a healthcare institution, is that if the employees in the healthcare institution are represented by a union, that union has an obligation to give the employer 10 days notice if they intend to engage in any sort of picketing, handbilling, or anything that might what's the phrase I'm looking for, that might induce other people to action and might therefore disrupt the ability of the employer to do healthcare. That's everything for the employer. For the unions, you still have an obligation to fairly represent your workers throughout the situation and to bargain with the employer as required under AP 1A and AP 3. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry.
Yep.
We are open for questions now. I'm going to I've been trying to keep some notes on this as we go along. So let me just get to that so you can see them. And Joel will be helping me as well on this. Just bear with me. Is that viewable to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to start with, before I get to any questions, I also forgot to acknowledge and thank Bill Canick for heading up the National Chapter Advisory Committee. Bill has been doing this for a long time. Thank you so much, Bill, for inviting our chapter to be part of this. What I'd like to pose to Freya and Elizabeth, are there particular approaches that you're leaning on more than others because they're more effective at increasing engagement?
I'm going to toss that one to Elizabeth to start.
Yeah. One, I think everybody's really feeling a lot of like meeting fatigue right now. Our brains are working a lot harder anytime something's on video because our brains are trying to imagine all of the information that you would get from an in-person meeting. So environmental factors, body language, all of that. So we're all trying to balance what is over communication and high quality communication, and then what is leading to Zoom fatigue. So I would be really critical about what those are. And then often keeping your meetings very short and expecting not to get as much done. Often like quick 15-minute meetings are more effective than an hour meeting or something like that. Next, I'm a person who uses a lot of note cards and Post-its and butcher paper in my facilitation, and web platforms do that so easily, and you can actually track those notes and brainstorming a lot easier than in person.
There is a lot of meeting fatigue. One just practical problem I'm running into is we don't have the same ability to caucus that when we're bargaining as we did before. So what we do is we have two rooms. We've got on one platform, we have the bargaining, and then on another platform, we have a caucus room. I always try and make every effort to debrief afterwards and then just send a quick email going over what we did and what our next steps are. So it is presenting a problem for bargaining. And although this question wasn't asked, I think it's important to talk about. Bargaining has changed so much. You're not looking at people in the same manner. You're not in the same room. So you're missing some of the body language and the other stuff that goes on. And I also think people are afraid and scared and don't know what the future holds. And so from the union perspective, I think we have to take our foot off the pedal a little bit.
Terry, one question that I'd like to pose to you. The Labor Board has always been adjudicating and investigating direct dealings with employees. And with the Zoom platform and the video conferencing, it's very easy for employers to be doing direct dealing in unionized settings. What should we know about the law and how you investigate direct dealing cases?
Well, direct dealing, you can talk to workers, even if they're represented workers, you can talk to workers about issues that come up. The problem comes when you start sort of negotiating with them. Well, how about you come in 15 minutes later and I don't worry about when you punch in, or when you start sort of discussing and debating with them some working conditions, and there's a union representation issue. If you start discussing changes and trying to get some kind of an agreement from an individual employee, you can really get yourself into trouble. If you've come up with a decision, we're going to give everybody the first 15 minutes, no charge. That's something you really need to talk to the union about first. You can then announce it. If you're going to make a change, announce it to the union first. You can then discuss it with your employees. If you discuss one-on-one with somebody and you start engaging in sort of trying to resolve a problem, you can get into problems with direct dealing.
I want to follow up on something Terry just said, what the employer can and can't do with regard to communications. And a lot of times our members don't know the law. They don't know what an employer can and can't do. And so that's why these frequent meetings are so important. A lot of times I'll talk to a leader, they'll say nothing's going on. And it's like, well, any direction to report to work? Is it voluntary? What kind of PPE do they have in place? And I said, if you guys are voluntarily going to work to help out with things, that's wonderful. Let's keep track of that. So when we're bargaining next time around, we can show the community and we can show the employer how you guys stepped up to the plate. So that was another door for that leader to reach out to all the members of the union and say, hey, if you're getting any email or phone calls to report to work, is it voluntary, is it not? Reach out to me so we can know what everyone's doing and make sure it's legitimate. As I always tell everyone, our members are the eyes and the ears of the union. A lot of times they think there's no big deal. I saw a stranger came in and was doing my job, lo and behold, they were, trying to subcontract work that's exclusive to the bargaining unit. So I think it's really important, Terry, and to everyone that we encourage our employees to be that eyes and ears for us and share what the employer does and doesn't tell them to do.
And just to hop on that real quick, that can also be done through really effective facilitation. So Terry, in order to make a space for her union members to tell her that, was quiet long enough and had built up enough trust that then they spoke about that. Because if you're just going on and not having multiple ways to engage and silence, people won't tell you really important information that allows you to better advocate.
So before we get into some of these questions, and Bernadette, if you could unmute the audience, that would be great. What I have been seeing in terms of the subject matter at the center of all of this with the companies I advise and their workforce is what is the well-being, the health and safety of the employees. And that is such a focusing type of issue and question that for employers, especially that have unions, to actually be talking to their union about. If an employer misses the fact that it's all about employee well-being, employee health and safety and protection, I think you're missing a really big opportunity to connect with your workforce and to connect with the bargaining representative. Obviously, this applies to non-union settings as well. Many of the communications that are going to happen are going to be happening not with labor relations and HR professionals, they're going to be happening with operational supervisors and managers. And that really begs the question, what do those operational supervisors and managers need to know to be, number one, effective in their engagement, and number two, not violate the law? Our regional director for a number of years here, and one of the, in addition to being very active in our LERA, one of the things that she's done, and I would recommend for all of our government agencies, is to do outreach with the folks they do business with. And Terry has always been open to speaking to our LERA group, employer groups. Our region here under Terry's leadership has been doing education. This is going to help us as managers in companies and probably representatives in labor organizations to train those people that may not know these things. I'm going to go to the first question here. I hope all of you can see it. And that is, what COVID-19 patterns in Michigan are likely to be continuing for better or worse and afterwards? And I'll open this up to the panelists as well as anybody in the audience that might be interested in commenting.
Festivals or whatever.
No, I know. It's going to be really odd. There won't be a summer festival this year, but there
having
won't
to
be.
look at 6 or 7 or more people in a time crunch. So
You may need to remute people, Bernadette.
We did.
And
I just
we'll-
remuted everybody. But
Okay,
if we want to use the hand raise feature, if they raise their hand, then we can unmute individually.
Thank you. So panelists or audience, anybody want to comment on that first question?
In Michigan is going to be very different in terms of the work that I do, because public education, and we're not sure what that will look like in the fall. K through 12 is whether, in addition to higher education, will it be remote learning, actual kids in seats, or will it be some combination thereof? And what impact will that have on the work, the number of hours people work, what they get paid, how they do their work?
Hi there, I'm Deborah Payton Jones, and the way it's going to change for us, it's already begun. I work at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City, and Freya, just to let you know, we're probably the only wall-to-wall union where we represent staff and faculty here in New York, and we already found out that our online presence or a remote presence, because there's a difference with the terminology versus online learning versus remote learning. So our remote learning and our remote orientation will take place in August. We found out yesterday. So as we're moving towards what we're going to be doing here in New York, while we wait for our pause that our governor has put in place to expire on the 15th, which is tomorrow, he's already said that we are in level 4 as far as the opportunity for us to be moving forward. Our whole area is in level 4, and we've only begun 1. So we're not looking at opening up educationally for quite some time. So as far as the question goes, we will be remote for orientation, and we've just begun doing video and looking at to see how that is going to look for all the students coming August.
Deborah, do you represent the company or the union?
I am the assistant treasurer with our union, so I'm on here today as a union rep.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
On this COVID-19 pattern question, we are going to be restarting a lot of businesses. And one of the things I want to point out, especially to employers, is as we do that, there will definitely be some restructurings. There's going to be some recalls from layoff. There's going to be a different design to our organizations. And all of this brings into question, what do we need to know about discrimination laws and other legal protections? As we call back people, or as we divvy up assignments, we still have to comply with anti-discrimination statutes around race, disability, all of the protected class statuses. And giving some thought to this ahead of time is probably a good idea. We're still going to be doing recruitment in companies, and that means some people are going to be brought into the organization while other people are left out. Whether this is a collective bargaining issue or not, I think it probably is, but we definitely have the regulatory environment that we have to be aware of. Next on this, we were asked if we would share our speaker notes in PowerPoint. I will be sharing the PowerPoint. If Freya, Elizabeth, or Terry have some notes that they want to make available, you can send them to me and I'll send them out through LERA. I've also included the contact information for Elizabeth, Freya, myself, and Terry. I've been trying to keep track of some of what Terry said. NLRB.gov is a wonderful website. It's an educational website. The one case she was talking about was Danbury, and the general counsel opinion can be found at GC 2004. Terry, can you explain the 10-day notice issue again?
Sure. It only applies in the healthcare setting. So any kind of company, employer that its sole mission is healthcare. It only applies where there are union represented employees involved. If a union intends to handbill or picket or decides that the nurses aren't going to work overtime shifts anymore, they have to give 10 days notice to the employer that they intend to take this action to advance whatever issue they are protesting or trying to communicate to the public on. You have to give that 10 days notice. And that's to allow the employer to plan ahead in case that action results in some sort of interruption of the healthcare. So it's part of the board's the 1974 rules that the board adopted, protecting healthcare institutions. And it only applies to unions and labor organizations. It doesn't apply where there's unrepresented workers.
Okay. We got one other question. To further motivate the question, we see coalitions of governors and other emergent patterns that may have continuing meeting. Anybody want to comment on that?
I can take this one to start off. I'm actually really curious and excited about where this is going to go. And I think this is a great example of what a distributed governance system can look like within a larger nation. Yeah, the person commenting on this was probably referencing how a lot of the Great Lakes states governors have decided to open on a similar timeline. Same with the Northeastern states, same with a lot of the Western states. I don't know, I'm really excited and curious about the possibilities this holds. Because so many of these really pertinent choices are made on an individual level, a community level, and then on a state level. Because they're so much more nimble to respond to localized information. And there's a little bit of a dearth of national leadership right now. And I'm just excited to see where these more regional coalitions, how they'll serve people.
This is another wonderful organizing opportunity for us in Michigan because, you know, things are changing very quickly. Executive orders are issued by the governor. We want to encourage the legislature to take certain actions. So we reach out to our members. We inform, advise, persuade them on particular issues and ask them to connect with their local representatives or state senators and help make change. Even as low as the school board level, local school board, all the way up to Lansing, our capital. So it's a great opportunity. It does, Elizabeth, I agree with you. It's really exciting because people are like, I really can make a difference. I can urge my legislators to do something on a particular issue. So we're seeing much more engagement. And as we all know, it's like way easy to stay in your pajamas and go online instead of actually having to like go lobby at the Capitol. So we're seeing much more participation than we had in the past when we were telling people, leave your kids and come to a meeting 2 hours away. So I agree with you. It's exciting, and engagement that we haven't seen before, we are seeing now.
Bob, if I could go back to question number one, emerging patterns. Let's think 90 days down the road here, both public and private sectors. What's the likelihood of wildcats and the response to them?
So before we engage in that, Larry Sadowski is one of our FMCS commissioners in the area, and he's in the middle of many of these collective bargaining issues. So thanks for your comment. Anybody want to launch off on Larry's comment or question? Well, I'll start. And here is something that I have been thinking about and talking about for a long time. As the labor movement has lost some of its voice and actually some of its motivation to engage in collective action, we have seen others fill that vacuum, whether it's the Occupy movement or the issue of essential workers talking about their terms and conditions and some of their protections. I think we're going to see a lot more of that happening in non-organized settings. That's my view. And I think places like Amazon and Walmart and Target are making some very serious mistakes by not listening to their employers, their employees. Just as a human condition, we all want to be heard and understood. And if we don't figure out as employers what they're concerned about, I think there will be more of it, Larry.
To jump on that from a more
we're approaching the end of it. Go ahead.
Oh, to jump on that from a more a pretty boots on the ground perspective, I'm on calls weekly about different mutual aid efforts that often have very direct action and strike-oriented goals. I was on a Michigan statewide call last night about organizing statewide rent strikes, and especially on the West Coast in Portland, the Burgerville Workers Union just joined the Wobblies, actually, and I would expect strikes from them, and a lot of smaller organizations that and workers that are typically not inclined towards bureaucracy. I think we're going to see a lot more informal wildcat strikes and things that are more akin to sick outs, where a coordinated group of workers all take sick days at the same time. Also, I'm actually really concerned about very low paid workers intentionally not following deeply inadequate personal protective equipment policies as like a way to gain power and retaliation against employers too. So I think those are the three ways I see that playing out in the next 90 days.
So I want to answer a couple other questions here. Deborah, this will be recorded and it will be available. You can go to the LERA website. All of these webinars are recorded, and they're really, the production value on it is really great. Let me see. As we navigate toward a new way of communicating, has there been much conversation around keeping an eye towards diversity and the potential for biases? Panelists?
I can open up with that one. At least in the conversations I've been in, because COVID is really highlighting the class, racial, and access differences between a wide variety of people. A lot of conversations are evolving around how can we engage people who have different levels of internet access, people who have different levels of wealth and what that means for the literal architecture of the buildings you're living in, and how that gives you different levels of privacy, time to concentrate, what your childcare duties are, what sort of access you have with all of the disparities in our healthcare system. And like Freya was saying, because everybody is so online right now, there's tons of actually artwork being created that highlights all of these differences in really bite-sized pieces. One of the groups that I follow really closely is called Training for Change. And then there's another one called August Consultancy. They're putting near weekly ways of engaging people across a diversity of different ways of engagement, not only online. But I think that is really essential. And I think our organizations make better decisions when we're taking into account everybody's different perspective. Because me, in all of the different identities that I occupy, I only am seeing such a small view of all of the information available. And we are all only seeing such a small view. So if we put all of these facets together, we're able to see a much wider, have a much wider perspective on any decisions, organizing, or engagement we're making. Thanks for that question. It's a really great one.
Okay, so we've reached the witching hour. We're now at 11 o'clock. We'll be closing this momentarily within seconds, but before we do that, thank you, LERA. Thank you, LERA staff, Joel, Tom, Bill. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Freya. I'm looking forward to seeing you all one day where we can actually maybe shake hands, share a meal, talk about something on the walk to the next session. But until then, please be safe, be well, and be in touch. Thank you.
Thank
Take
you
care.
all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.